Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, articles, research history, and distill them down to the insights that really matter.
And today, we are opening up what is, one of the shortest, but also one of the most powerful books in the Old Testament.
The Book of Ruth.
Exactly. It's this perfectly constructed, four-chapter masterpiece. And our main source today, an essay called Ruth, A Beacon of Faith in Dark Times, it just captures the brilliance of it by setting the scene so dramatically.
It really does. It places us squarely in the era of the Judges.
Which is a very dark time.
Oh, that context is everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
The era of the Judges is just characterized by this moral decline.
Complete instability.
A spiritual freefall,
Yeah.
really. And it's all summed up in that haunting phrase that comes back again and again in the book, and it culminates in that heartbreaking line.
In those days, there was no king in Israel.
Everyone did as they saw fit.
And that phrase, it speaks of this profound moral drift, this decentralized chaos. The violence was just self-perpetuating.
Spiritual anarchy.
It is. The very structure of society that God had ordained through the law, you see it unraveling because people are just substituting divine authority for their own personal preference.
And then against that massive, dark backdrop of national disobedience, this small, quiet story of a foreign widow just appears. It's a narrative centered on devotion, on diligence, and this stunning loyalty. The essay sets up this really powerful contrast, showing Ruth's path moving so faithfully from
famine and funeral to harvest and family.
It's a beautiful summary.
And that contrast, really, that is the entire mission of this deep dive for you, the listener. We're tracing the subtle but absolutely persistent hand of a God who, even in the messy details of human history and national failure, he never forgets the lowly.
Or the faithful.
Or the faithful. The story's arc is majestic because it shows how the Lord is meticulously guarding his promises to Israel, that covenant line, while at the same time, he's welcoming a Gentile Ruth directly into the family.
And not just any family. The family that will lead to King David.
And ultimately, to David's greater son. It's all right there in the genealogy at the end.
It's this incredible story about God's sweeping plan playing out in the smallest, most personal choices. So let's unpack the defining moment right away, because it's the hinge that the whole story turns on.
Okay, yes. That's the moment when Naomi, who is just broken and empty, is urging her two Moabite daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to go back, to return to their families, to their gods in Moab.
And Orpah leaves tearfully. But Ruth
makes that renowned declaration, where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God.
And on the surface, that sounds like this overwhelming expression of family love, of affection for Naomi.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's much more radical than just simple devotion.
Oh, absolutely. The source is very clear on this. This was an act of profound, deliberate conversion. Ruth isn't just tagging along out of, a sense of obligation.
She's cutting ties.
She is actively cutting ties. She's renouncing her family, her heritage, her land, her security, and critically, she's renouncing Chemosh, the war god of Moab. She is seeking refuge under the wings of the Lord, the God of Israel.
That is a profound spiritual movement. It's rooted in faith, not convenience.
Yeah.
To leave everything you know, your home, your gods, your language, your whole support system, for a foreign land and a foreign God, that is a high-cost decision.
It's the moment she commits to the covenant community, and the faith that anchored her was just immense because she committed at a moment of absolute loss. Think about it. Famine and death had claimed everything. Her life felt completely broken, utterly empty.
And
yet she believed that the God who sent the famine could also restore, that he could fill the fields in her life again. She made this conscious covenant choice to return to the Lord's ordered ways, embracing a future that offered her zero guarantees. She was starting from nothing.
That commitment brings us straight into the crucial context then. Before we really walk through the narrative, we have to grasp the historical and cultural background that makes her choices so radical and so faithful.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the geography alone tells the story. It's filled with irony.
It starts in Bethlehem.
Bethlehem, which literally means house of bread. But the story opens during a devastating famine.
So the house of bread has no bread.
Exactly. And this lack of sustenance forces this Israelite family, Elimelech and Naomi, to move east, across the Jordan River to Moab. The deep irony there is it's heartbreaking. It's suggestive of the covenant curses taking effect because of Israel's unfaithfulness.
So this move to Moab was clearly an act of desperation. It's a severe step for an Israelite family. And we can't just gloss over Moab's history. It had a severely strained relationship with Israel. Why is that history so critical here?
It's absolutely essential for understanding the gravity of Ruth's choice and really the magnitude of God's grace. Moab's origins, they trace back to Lot and his eldest daughter, so they're related to Israel but distinct.
But the relationship was antagonistic.
Deeply antagonistic. Spiritually, nationally, their religious practices were centered on the worship of Chemosh,
Who is Chemosh?
a cruel, state-sponsored god associated with war and fertility, often demanding, demanding child sacrifice. Historically, we know Moabite kings hired Balaam to curse Israel. And later, Moabite women successfully lured Israel into widespread idolatry and sexual immorality.
Which led to a plague.
A severe plague that killed thousands. So no, this was not a friendly place. It was seen as a corrupting influence on Israel.
So for an Israelite family to move there, it was a move of last resort, an exile driven by hunger. But for Ruth, a Moabite woman raised in that culture, to choose to return to Israel, I mean, she had to overcome centuries of national hostility, religious tension.
Ingrained spiritual difference. She was abandoning a culture that valued survival and war, that's Chemosh, for a covenant that valued justice and mercy, Yahweh. And this is where the grace shown to her just shines so brightly.
How so?
The source makes a key distinction. Moab was not Canaan.
Okay, can you
Right.
elaborate on that? Why does that specific location matter so much when we're talking about God's grace?
It matters because there were certain decrees of judgment that fell upon the Canaanites who had forfeited their land through grotesque wickedness. Moab was a historical enemy, yes, but the door of grace wasn't explicitly locked to Gentiles who genuinely turned to Israel's God.
So grace acknowledges the past.
It does. It's not naive about the dangers of Chemosh worship, but it isn't bound by that national history of hostility. Ruth's physical return with Naomi, after burying her husband and sons, feeling completely empty, was fundamentally a spiritual movement, a movement back toward the covenant community and the ordered ways of the Lord.
And the genius of God's law is that it actually provided specific lifelines, these social structures, for people exactly like Ruth and Naomi.
For the vulnerable, the widow, the foreigner, yes.
Let's look at the first one, the law of gleaning.
Gleaning is a perfect, tactile example of how mercy was structurally built into Israel's entire land system. It wasn't an afterthought.
It was part of the design.
Absolutely. The law commanded farmers not to harvest the corners of their fields. They couldn't go back for sheaves they missed. They couldn't strip their olive trees or vineyards clean. Those overlooked portions were specifically reserved for the poor, the fatherless, the widow, and crucially, the foreigner.
So this wasn't just charity, based on how the farmer was feeling that day. It was a covenant mandate.
It was an obligation, and it was rooted deeply in theology. The ultimate reason for this was that the land fundamentally belonged to the Lord. They were only stewards, not absolute owners.
That puts the farmer's generosity in a whole new perspective. It's an act of obedience, not just philanthropy.
Exactly. They were commanded to remember their own history, that they were once foreigners and destitute slaves in Egypt. They had received mercy, so they had to extend mercy. And Ruth, as soon as she arrives, she steps right into this system with this immediate, desperate diligence, gathering among the sheaves to make sure she and Naomi can survive.
And then there's the other crucial lifeline, the one that provides the legal engine for the whole story,
For the kinsman redeemer.
the Goel. We hear this term a lot as the key to their restoration.
The Goel was a specific near relative who had these legal and familial responsibilities built into the law. The whole system was designed to keep families and their estates whole.
So how did that actually function in their society?
It had two primary functions that often overlapped. First, they could buy back land that a poor relative had been forced to sell, restoring the inheritance to the clan. And second, which is specific to this case, the Goel could perform a levirate-like duty, marrying the childless widow of the deceased relative to raise up a name for the dead man, making sure his lineage and his inheritance continued within the family.
It sounds like a remarkable safety net, binding family responsibility to legal provision. But practically, what if the nearest relative was broke or just unwilling? Did the system ever fail?
That is a critical question. The law provided the framework, but the whole system relied on the piety and the willingness of the family members.
On the integrity of the goal?
Exactly. If the nearest relative was self-interested, the system could absolutely fail the vulnerable. And that is precisely the tension we see play out in Chapter 4. These provisions, as the source notes, they weren't intended to be complex loopholes for the clever.
They were lifelines.
Essential lifelines for the vulnerable. They profoundly demonstrate that the Lord's holiness doesn't just express itself in rules, but in a mandate for justice and active care for the widowed members of society.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. Connecting this intimate story of two widows on the margins to the whole destiny of the nation. The conclusion introduces what the essay calls the royal horizon.
That concluding genealogy is what elevates this story far beyond just a charming local anecdote. It frames Ruth's personal rescue as a deliberate, providential act of God preserving a specific line.
The line of Perez, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse.
Which would eventually secure the throne of Israel through David. This whole quiet narrative is revealed to be a necessary precondition for the future king.
And that future extends so much further than David's reign. This isn't just about one dynasty. It's about the fulfillment of all the covenant promises.
Absolutely. That line of David points directly to the ultimate fulfillment in the Messiah, David's greater son, who will sit on that throne and rule in righteousness for eternity.
So what does Ruth's inclusion of Moabite tell us about the scope of God's plan, especially when it comes to the nations?
Well, the theological placement here is fascinating. The source notes that Ruth's inclusion, a Gentile, shows that God's blessing for the nations sits within his covenant dealings with Israel, not in place of them.
Can we break that down a bit? That idea of blessing within the covenant structure.
Certainly. God's original promise to Abraham was that through his seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed. Ruth is an early, powerful, tangible fulfillment of that promise. God is bringing the nations to himself, but he's doing it through the chosen vehicle of Israel and the Davidic line.
So it anticipates the inclusion of the nations without dissolving the unique promises made to Israel.
Exactly. It's a concept Paul clarifies later when he discusses the future of Israel in Romans. It's all part of the same unified divine plan.
Okay, so now that we have that cultural and historical landscape set, let's move chronologically through the 4 short chapters. This part of the narrative is all about watching God's providence unfold in steps so small they almost look like chance.
And the first chapter is just defined by the depth of Naomi's grief. I mean, famine drove her away, and then death emptied her house in Moab. She comes back home and tells the women of Bethlehem, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me."
Her naming herself Mara, which means bitter, is such a raw, honest expression of her spiritual state. She's not blaming others. She feels the hand of God has disciplined her heavily.
Her pain is immense, and the text just validates that. It's so important to see her lament. She isn't unbelieving, but she is faith under immense weight. Yet even in that darkness, the narrative gives us this subtle, quiet hint of hope right at the end of chapter 1.
She returns home at the start of the harvest.
Exactly. Even in her bitterness, the text notes she came home at the beginning of the barley harvest. That timing is no accident. It's a subtle but powerful signal that the God who disciplines, the God who allows emptiness, also knows the exact time for restoration and for filling.
And while Naomi is focused on her emptiness, Ruth is right there.
Walking right beside her. A companion established not by blood, but by covenant choice. That commitment is the seedbed for everything that follows.
And chapter 2 gives us one of the most powerful, and I think often overlooked, concepts in the whole Bible. Sovereignty in the details, hidden in that little phrase, as it turned out.
Yes. Ruth, after arriving, she asks Naomi for permission to go out and glean. And the text then says she, as it turned out, found herself in the field of Boaz.
That phrase is beautiful. It's so simple, but it's deceptively powerful. On the surface, it just reads like luck. What does the theologian see underneath that?
We see the sovereignty of God at work, managing the intersection of human free will and divine purpose. You could read this and think, oh, how lucky that she picked the field owned by a rich, nice man. But theologically, there is no luck. It is God ordering the path of the widows and the field of the Redeemer to intersect at precisely the right moment. It takes something that seems completely arbitrary, which path she took that morning, and reveals it as divinely ordered.
It's the assurance that the most mundane, seemingly random moment of our day might be the precise intersection of God's plan for us.
That's the hope it offers. And the man whose field she lands in, Boaz, he's not just wealthy. He's described as noble in character, a righteous leader. And his management style immediately provides this stark contrast to the chaos we see in the era of the judges.
Just his greeting alone sets the standard for how authority should be used.
Absolutely. He greets his workers in the Lord's name. "The Lord be with you." And they reply, "The Lord blesses you." This shows a culture of piety and accountability in his field. He then notices Ruth, learns who she is, and shows a kindness that goes well beyond the strict requirements of the law.
He tells her to stay close to his young women. He orders his men not to harm her.
A critical protection in a disordered time like that.
Yes.
And not to sexually harass her.
But then he takes the mercy of gleaning even further. He adds this proactive layer of grace that just transforms the whole process.
He does. And this is where covenant love expresses itself through ordinary, everyday authority. The law required him to leave the corners of the field. But Boaz instructs his men to pull out some stalks on purpose for her to gather.
Wow.
So she's allowed to gather from the edges, but he's making the job easier, more dignified, and far more abundant. It's generosity outpacing obligation.
And when Ruth, recognizing her status as a foreigner, she bows down and asks why she found such favor, Boaz gives this incredible blessing.
He connects her diligence to her faith. He blesses her, he names her loyalty to Naomi, and crucially, he confirms the depth of her conversion by saying she has come to take refuge, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. That powerful image, that's the confirmation of God's acceptance and his protection over her.
And she returns home that evening not just with enough food for the day, but with an entire ephah of barley, a huge amount, maybe 30, 50 pounds, and crucially with the name of a potential redeemer.
And that sparks the first real hope in Naomi's house.
The whole narrative shifts.
It shifts from survival to salvation. Naomi hears the name Boaz, and she recognizes the legal and spiritual pathway that's opening up. She says, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our guardian redeemers. The timing is now ripe for action."
Which sets the stage for the bold, pivotal action of chapter 3. Naomi, rooted in her age and knowledge of Israel's customs, she sees the path to permanent security for Ruth.
She counsels Ruth very carefully, and this leads to the famous and often sensitive threshing floor scene. Ruth is instructed to approach Boaz at night. She uncovers his feet and asks him to spread the corner of his garment over her.
Okay, this action, happening at night on a secluded threshing floor, we have to contextualize this carefully for our audience. The source is very clear about its nature.
It needs careful framing, you're right. The threshing floor was a place of labor, of harvest celebration. The landowner often slept there to guard the crop. Ruth's action is a bold appeal within custom, but it is explicitly not seduction. Spreading the garment is a profound nonverbal picture word for assuming responsibility, for protection, for marriage.
She's asking him, as the Gaul, to fulfill his duty.
To cover her and to raise up a name for her deceased husband.
Yes.
And Boaz responds with just immense integrity.
He praises her immediately. He calls her a worthy woman and praises her for seeking a godly match instead of, chasing younger men for passion or wealth. This confirms her motive was covenant security and integrity.
And he promises to act.
The very next morning. But he immediately sets the legal boundary, showing his adherence to the law, even when it complicates his own desire.
Because he's not the newest redeemer. That's the critical obstacle.
It is. He can't circumvent the system, even for a noble cause. He swears by the Lord that if the nearer relative declines the next morning, then he will redeem her. He won't cut corners. He has to honor that first claim.
And then as a final pledge, he sends her home.
Before dawn, with 6 measures of barley, a demonstration of his commitment to act and a way of protecting her reputation.
Which brings us to chapter 4, the great climax. Redemption accomplished. Boaz moves the whole transaction into the most public forum possible, the town gate, which was their municipal court, the center of commerce and legal proceedings. Boaz gathers 10 elders as formal witnesses and summons the unnamed nearer relative.
And he lays out the requirement plainly. Buying Naomi's field means you also have to take Ruth the Moabite as your wife.
To raise up the name of the dead, land and lineage are legally and spiritually bound together.
And the brilliance of the story just hinges on this unnamed relative's calculated refusal.
It does. The nearer relative declines because he feels he would impair his own estate. He sees the financial cost, the familial complexity, marrying a Moabite widow, dedicating assets to a child who wouldn't even bear his name.
He sees it as too great a risk.
He prioritizes his own financial future over the covenant obligation of redemption.
That selfish calculation is the perfect foil to Boaz's noble commitment.
And it forces him to perform the ancient custom of taking off his sandal, formally transferring the right of redemption to Boaz. Boaz then formally acquires the right to redeem in front of the elders and all the people. He secures the land, and most importantly, he secures Ruth as his wife.
And the public blessing that follows is just magnificent. It connects the story right back to that larger national destiny.
The elders and the people, they bless the union. They pray the house of Boaz would be like that of Perez, an important ancestor, and that Ruth would build up the house of Israel. And the story then concludes with a cradle.
Obed is born.
And the women bless Naomi, proclaiming that the Lord has not left you without a guardian redeemer.
It's the ultimate reversal. The woman who came back saying she was Mara, bitter and empty, is now holding a grandson in her lap who will be the grandfather to a king. The narrative that started with famine and funerals ends with fulfillment and a future.
So, having traced the story, we can move seamlessly into its theological significance. The story of Ruth teaches us about the very character of God through the texture of ordinary life.
The first major theme, which we saw in chapter 2, is providence in ordinary life. And I think many believers confine that idea of providence to, grand dramatic miracles.
That's a common misunderstanding. Our source defines providence much more broadly. It is God's wise rule and sovereign control over details, small enough to miss. That phrase, as it turned out, that isn't divine apathy, it's the human limited perspective on God's perfect management.
It's how providence looks from the ground.
When you're just doing the next faithful thing, yes. The fact that Ruth chose that specific field, or that Boaz chose that day to greet his reapers, was not a coincidence. It was a culmination of deliberate divine orchestration.
The same God who gives us life and breath
Is ordering the specific path of two vulnerable widows and the heart of a specific landowner so that his massive purposes, all the way to the Davidic line, can ripen with the harvest. It means the most mundane moment of your day might be the precise intersection of God's most critical plan.
And that truth offers profound solace for the Naomi in all of us, the one who is suffering.
It does. Naomi felt the Almighty's hand was heavy and bitter upon her. But her experience confirms that profound grief does not mean God is absent or that his providence has failed. He is still God, still sovereign, even when the final good end is completely unseen from the middle of the pain.
She was able later to confess that the Lord had renewed her life
and sustained her in her old age. Grief is simply faith under weight.
Let's move to the Goel theme again. The kinsman-redeemer principle is more than just a legal custom. It beautifully binds law and love together.
Redemption, as defined in Leviticus, is fundamentally financial and familial. It's about buying back property, securing a name, keeping an inheritance safe. It can be cold law. But in the hands of Boaz, that law becomes this warm, active expression of covenant love.
So how does he transcend the strict letter of the law?
Well, he honors the legal process perfectly. The nearer claim, the public gate, the formal witnesses, that's holiness-keeping order. But he adds mercy where the law is silent. The law didn't demand he risk his estate. It didn't require him to provide extra stocks for Ruth. It didn't require him to rush the process at the gate.
He adds protection and generosity.
Kindness keeping pace with the deep, holistic need. The law framed the path, but covenant love is what filled it out and brought it to fruition.
And this theology of redemption really provides the foundation for the next profound theme, the inclusion of the nations.
Ruth's identity is absolutely vital. She's a Moabite who actively renounces idols and embraces Israel, deliberately seeking refuge under the Lord's wings. Her story showcases Israel's ultimate calling, that through Abraham's seed, blessing was always meant to flow outward to the nations.
Ruth is an early living manifestation of that.
Exactly. And her inclusion in the genealogies running through David and straight to Jesus, that anticipates the King of the nations. She is intentionally tethered to Jesus, the son of David and the Savior of the world. The fact that the royal line runs through a Moabite reminds us that God's grace overcomes every ethnic and national barrier.
You mentioned earlier the distinction that this blessing sits within God's covenant with Israel. Why is maintaining that clarity so important for understanding God's full plan?
It's important because it preserves the integrity of God's covenant promises. The grace is wide, bringing Gentiles like Ruth and us into the family through faith, but it does not dissolve what God specifically pledged to national Israel. The church today gathers both Jew and Gentile through faith, but the national promises made to Israel still remain.
So Ruth is proof that God's plan is unified. The blessing for the nations comes through Israel's covenant structure, not around it.
Precisely.
And finally, Boaz serves as a powerful and compelling type of the greater Redeemer. He's good, but he points beyond his own goodness.
Boaz performs the role perfectly in his own time. He pays the price, he restores a future, he covers a vulnerable woman with his name, and he secures a line. All of these actions echo the work of Christ.
So how does that look when we scale it up to Christ's superior redemption? Where's the greatest point of difference?
The difference is primarily in the currency and the scope. Boaz redeems with silver, with land, with his good name. Christ's redemption is infinitely superior because he shed his blood, a costly, perfect sacrifice, to purchase people for God from every tribe and language, securing an imperishable inheritance that no famine or death can ever touch.
The cross provides the ultimate security, making our redemption not just legal, but life-giving.
Exactly. The cross is the ultimate redemption accomplished, the price paid fully and publicly. And the empty tomb isn't just a symbol, it is life-given, the absolute reversal of death and loss. Ruth's cradle whispers the truth that God brings life out of loss, but Christ's resurrection shouts it for the entire world to hear.
That theological groundwork sets us up perfectly for the spiritual lessons and application, which is really where the rubber meets the road for us today. The first lesson is drawn directly from Ruth's constancy.
Ruth's constancy is the quiet resilience of faith lived out in small, loyal decisions. When Naomi gave her the opportunity for a convenient, easy exit back to Moab, Ruth chose loyalty.
And that choice was expensive. It meant embracing poverty, uncertainty. What does that constancy look like when we try to apply it to our modern lives?
It looks like diligence when convenience suggests otherwise. It means living out your vows, whether to God, to a spouse, to a church community, through the daily grind. Through the early mornings, the tired hands, the long periods where you don't see immediate results.
In the age of quick exits.
And consumer loyalty that lasts only as long as the product is perfect. Ruth's steadfastness is a profound challenge. It calls us to bear one another's burdens, to remain present for people and commitments when it's difficult.
That constancy of faith keeps step with love.
It refuses to walk away just because the path has become painful.
The second key lesson comes from Naomi's lament, the importance of honesty and return.
Naomi shows us that believers should speak honestly to God about their pain, about their bitterness. She named herself Mara, and she did not varnish her sorrow. She told God the truth about her experience of his hand. We are given permission to lament.
So lament is not a form of unbelief, but an expression of faith.
It is faith under weight. Lament is telling God the absolute truth of your suffering while simultaneously holding on to the hope that he is still good, still capable of fulfilling his promise. Naomi didn't just stay in bitterness, she returned to the Lord's people and waited for him to act.
The lesson being,
The harvest may take longer than a season, but the promise is true. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. The path from Mara to renewed life is paved with honest prayer and persistent presence in the covenant community.
moving to Boaz, we see lesson 3, righteousness with power. He shows us what integrity looks like when you hold a position of authority.
Boaz models this for every person in a position of leadership, employers, community figures, citizens with influence. He used his position, his wealth, his authority to protect the foreigner, the vulnerable, and the widow, not to prey upon them.
It's a powerful counter-narrative to the disorder of the Judges era. He stands out because he feared God more than he feared public opinion or personal gain.
And that fear of God meant his accountability was absolute. His blessing of his workers in the Lord's name shows his daily business was an act of worship. And this challenges all of us. The judge of all the earth sees how we run our businesses, how we hire our staff, how we treat those below us. The way we run our fields can become a channel for God's justice and mercy.
Lesson 4 is the practical application of corporate mercy, exemplified by the gleaning provision and what that means for the church today.
This is a direct challenge to the covenant community. Israel's farmers didn't wait for the desperate to beg. They structurally built mercy into their rhythms by leaving room at the edges.
That's a crucial distinction. Mercy wasn't an emergency fund. It was an ingrained, expected habit.
Precisely. They were commanded to remember that God had left room for them when he brought them out of Egypt. For modern congregations, this means creating budget lines for benevolence, not just emergencies. It means designing pathways for support that preserve the dignity of the person receiving help. It means consistently remembering the stranger, the widow, the fatherless in tangible, proactive ways.
The goal, then, is not just to be nice, but to reflect the comprehensive love and justice of God.
It's to reflect pure and faultless religion, which looks after those in distress in our immediate community, not just those we see across the globe. We are called to embody the same structural mercy that was built into the harvest of Israel.
And finally, lesson 5, steadfast hope. The assurance that none of our ordinary lives or acts of faithfulness are wasted.
You know, as we see news cycles churning and life feels chaotic, the book of Ruth studies us. God was preparing the line of David, securing the world's future, while Ruth was simply spending hours gleaning barley one stalk at a time. He's never scrambling. His purposes are always ripening.
We are called to live as a redeemed people, diligently doing the next right thing in front of us, trusting that God sees the connection between the small act and the grand purpose.
And that daily trust carries monumental weight, knowing that none of it, the simple act of service, the whispered prayer, the kindness shown, the commitment maintained, none of it is wasted in his hands. The king we await has already come to save, and he will surely come again to reign in righteousness.
What a journey. We started in the darkness of the Judges era with funerals and bitterness, and we conclude with a cradle and a blessing, all framed by the perfect, quiet work of God's providence.
And through this whole story, the Lord proves utterly faithful. He orders steps, even those that seem accidental, under the cover of as it turned out. He shelters those who seek refuge under his wings, and he carries forward promises that no famine can starve and no grave can stop.
Ruth's conversion, Naomi's return, and Boaz's costly kindness. They become the human conduits through which God preserves a royal line, writes a foreign name into his heritage, and keeps a covenant that secures the entire future.
This book calls us, especially those of us living in times that feel dark or disorderly, to the same simple trust. Take the next step in obedience. Be honest with God about your sorrow, protect the vulnerable in your sphere of influence, and always look beyond your own days to the true Redeemer.
He stands the center of history.
And in him, empty hands are filled, broken stories are healed, and the future is held secure.
The story culminates in that beautiful moment when the women bless Naomi after the birth of Obed, recognizing she has been fully restored. The source reminds us of their words that apply to us today.
Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age.
That right there is the main encouragement. The assurance that the Lord, who is securing the entire future of the world through the Davidic line, is also the guardian redeemer who sustains and renews your life in the present, even when you feel old or exhausted or empty.
May the Lord bless you and renew your life today, sustaining you through every season as you take refuge under his wings.